So our final speaker of the day is going to be pretty interesting. David, I think, might be winning an affiliation count. So day job, pay the bills, CISO, Keyrock. I think you're going to be hearing about that. Faculty over at Harvard, and then president of CISOs Connect. And you just gave me a flabbergasting number of CISOs when you said that.
Yeah, we have about 1,600 member CISOs. So.
Yeah, so this will be interesting.
Right, so I think I have, about 20 minutes or?
You have 25.
Okay, perfect. All right. Happy to join you guys today. I'm a former regulator, so this is going to be a little bit from the regulatory perspective as well. So before I joined the dark side, I went over to crypto. I was one of the regulators for the 8 largest banks in the world for pretty much all things cyber and IT risk. So we're going to approach it from very much a regulatory perspective. So back in 2023, I published, I think while I was still a regulator, I published an article for Forbes on 10 things that you should kind of take into consideration if you're a regulated institution and you're using AI and ML at the time. That didn't even take into account where we are with generative AI today, let alone agentic AI. So we're going to kind of build from that point of view. So from a regulatory point of view, we always start with the construct of safety and soundness. So we'll go through what the core concepts of that are and why it matters, especially if you're a regulated institution or plan on being a regulated institution. We'll look about the evolving threat landscape, which is different depending upon whether you're using generative AI versus agentic AI. We'll talk about some, unique challenges for agentic AI, and then we'll really talk about the other fundamental underpinning of this, or the foundation is going to be, really, do you have a good governance framework to help you manage through all of this? And by a governance framework, I don't mean what banks have traditionally done, where when you talk about model risk management, somebody gives you the Excel spreadsheet list of all the models that they think they have running. I mean actually real governance around it. We'll talk a little bit about the regulatory landscape as well as some of the emerging landscape, and we'll talk about just the CISO's view from some of the things that I've learned by actually having some of this stuff already deployed in the field. All right. Again, this is just the key takeaway from this slide is really looking at it from, when in 2023, when I wrote that first article, it was really about voluntary guidance, from that perspective. Now it's really moving to enforceable law. When you look at what's going on in Europe, when you look at what's coming here, so you really need to move from, treating this as, a nice to have, as something that you actually have to do, because you're going to face real compliance issues depending upon whether you're a global organization. All right. So as a regulator, safety and soundness essentially apply very well to anything AI and ML. So when you start thinking about safety and soundness, they're not the exact same thing, but it's two pieces of the same puzzle essentially. So you look at when we talk about safety, we're talking about the ability of a system to operate without causing harm. So by harm, we mean through a system malfunction, what the model can do, what are the guardrails that are put around it, what kind of testing was done around it, when does HITL come into the play, so those types of things. All right, so from a governance point of view, it's, I usually recommend essentially like an 8-step framework where, the first 4 are your foundational steps, that you have to have these before you jump into the bottom, and you would be surprised, and at least as a regulator, of how many people kind of skip the first 4 steps and all of a sudden jump into monitoring and think they know what's going on in their environment. So, we'll look at each of these for. All right, so governance, again, it sounds easy, but a lot of it's kind of like asset management. A lot of organizations, it's still painful, lots of organizations. So when you establish your framework, but you want to have clear ownership, so you want to have well-defined roles, well-defined responsibilities, well-defined decision rights. So, you need to know who's the business owner, who's the data owner, who's responsible from legal and compliance. So this stuff should be documented, and you should have kind of a cross-functional committee, especially when you're making decisions about, is it agentic and is it going to take high-risk actions. Ethics, again, I do teach an ethics class. So you have to go beyond the generic definitions of what it is. It's kind of like when was that a question or?
I accepted that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so from an ethics point of view, it needs to be specific to your business and your context. Just like organizations, we get into trouble where you'll find somebody has like the perfect policy on the internet. So when you take that policy and you make it yours and it's purely aspirational and something bad happens, we call that Exhibit A in court. Because what's going to happen is you're going to say, hey, you had this policy that says you are doing all of this amazing stuff, and then when you look at what happened, it'd be like, it turns out, okay, you're doing none of it. So you want to make sure that you have ethics principles that are kind of rooted in your business, defining what fairness means, within your organization and within your context. It's just like, when we talk about materiality, whether it's from a legal point of view or from a business point of view, what's material to one of the 8 largest banks in the world is going to be very different than what's material to a local credit union. You need to implement adversarial testing, and again, you want to look at it from the point of view that we all design these things with great intent, so we don't necessarily have an attacker's mindset. So you want these things tested for data poisoning, prompt injection, manipulation attacks, hallucination. You want somebody looking at it of like, how am I going to use this badly? Because the developers, again, you have a focused mindset of how they want this used in an ideal manner, so they're not going to think about it of, now, how can I abuse this thing? So you're going to look at like, what are your use cases that you test, and what are your abuse cases? The comprehensive AI inventory. So again, this is like, your AI asset management. You need to know where these things are, what are they running, what libraries do they have, who's the responsible owner, and what's the risk level of each of these different things. And then now we get into like the scaling and the regular operations. So once you have those first 4 steps, now you're like, okay, how do you maintain your transparency and explainability? And you can look at, are you compliant with things like the EU AI Act? What's your regulatory regime look like? How do you implement continuous monitoring and auditing? So not only looking at it from, are you managing drift? But if it's an agentic agent, you should have a baseline of, okay, when we first did the canary testing, maybe there was only 5% human intervention. If all of a sudden now you see things like it's 15%, what's going on? You want metrics in there that can tell you not only is there potential drift in the model, but maybe there's something wrong with the guardrails. Invest in training and awareness at every level. So this is important because you're going to find that everybody in the organization wants to use some form of AI. They're all going to use it differently. The developers are going to be leveraging Cursor to do certain things. They're going to be, you need to look at it from the point of view of how do you make sure that everybody that's using AI knows how to use it within, what's acceptable use for your organization. And this requires training. And the last one is the stakeholder engagement and the regulatory environment. So if you're in a highly regulatory environment, know your regulators ahead of time. It's like anything else. You want to participate in those communities and be active in those communities before something bad happens. You never want to wind up calling the FBI or seeing your regulators after something bad happened. You want to be interacting with these organizations and the standards bodies proactively, because then we'll get a feel for, okay, Victor knows what's going on, he's got a good program, something untoward happened. That's looked at as very differently as versus now something terrible happened and this is the first time I'm even meeting you, seeing you, I have no idea what's going on. All right, so looking at some of the specific threat landscape, we kind of touched on these, and based on time I won't take too much, but again, you want to look at how do you deal with prompt injection, data poisoning, model evasion. How do you deal with your data exfiltration, which is becoming a very big issue right now, because your typical DLP tools may not help you in this case. How do you look at drift? And again, how do you look at what's this mean to your supply chain attacks from that perspective? All right. Some specific agentic ones are looking at, okay, is it possible to hijack the agent? Is it possible to get the agents to collude? And again, agents operate with permissions of their deploying user or service account. So this is when you have to revisit that whole least privilege all over again, but you have to look at it from a point of view of, instead of RBAC, it needs to be like ABAC, the attribute-based control, so you have that fine level of granularity, which is painful to set up and get right, but you need to do it, otherwise you're going to have unintended consequences. You need to evaluate, what's the potential for autonomous attack chains. And you need to look at what's the irreversibility of some of these actions. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess, or whatever. Can you give an example of where you feel like ABAC is critical for agentic systems? Like that.
So, I mean, I'm looking at it right now within the construct of having certain agents be able to query very sensitive systems in my organization, where all of a sudden I don't want it to expose trading algorithms, I don't want it to expose positions improperly, because again, I have groups that are like asset wealth management, I have trading groups, so not only do I have to maintain separation between those two internal teams where they can't share information, but I don't want somebody from the outside as well being able to gain insights from my models as far as we're about to take a big position or we're about to market make for a certain organization and be able to essentially cause insider trading types of activity. The action irreversibility also with these agents that are talking to all these things, the last thing I want to do is somebody overwrite my trading algorithms, overwrite things in finance as well. So I have to look at it as how do I minimize, or just keep this stuff focused on my short-term memory, so if something bad happens, it hasn't modified my actual long-term storage. Identity access, management, so this is like what's old is new again. So now it's looking at, making sure you don't get back to the bad habits, no shared passwords, no poorly managed machine accounts. You need to think about it from the point of view of not only does each have its own identity, how is it tokenized, how do you do a kill switch so if something bad starts happening, you can revoke the credentials right away and minimize the blast radius. So again, now all of a sudden you have a fleet of highly privileged machine accounts that are running that can essentially take different actions. So you need to be able to have continuous monitoring around them. You need to make sure that you have audit trails around them, because again, if you're regulated and something bad happens, you're going to have to be able to produce those logs. All right, Victor?
Can we go back to that slide?
Yep.
That's super insightful. So are you still referring to the legacy security software like MFAs and all
Yeah.
that to kind of manage the agent, right?
Yeah.
But do you see there's any certain use cases that we actually have to invent a new set of security control?
So I think ABAC is going to come back. So the attribute-based access control, because you want that finer level of granularity of, when it's interacting with either multiple agents or multiple systems, how can I really give it the least privilege of access versus, what we traditionally do if we apply standard RBAC controls, that might actually be too permissive. So in some cases, yes. In other cases, most organizations have that RBAC kind of setup. But now when you look at it, if I have things that are connecting to, I don't know, like my Notion, my Slack, my other things, I'm going to be very particular. I want that at the attribute level. I don't want that at a group level. I want to be able to limit that specifically to be able, like, you'll only touch this section of Notion. You'll only touch, this area. Whereas if you do that, that's very hard to do if you do standard RBAC.
So this is a pretty high bar for a
Yeah.
regular enterprise, much less a financial or highly regulated. So
Yeah.
you've seen both sides. So is your company successfully navigating this? And are the auditors and regulators even able to keep up with all the change?
Regulations always run behind tech, from that aspect of it. However, as slow as the regulations evolve, plaintiff attorneys don't wait for that. Yeah, so you can think of it, you can wait for specific regulations to come out. Like, I contributed to the FFIEC Joint Statement on Cloud at the time when I was a regulator, but that was still, 3 to 5 years after Amazon had already been out, and we were just getting there. So you have to look at it from the point of view that the regulators are getting there, and they're getting better about it, but when you think about the fact that there are very large law firms watching this stuff closely, and that can have a significant impact. If somebody brings a class action against your organization, that might even be worse than a regulatory fine.
So from a risk perspective, if you don't have these capabilities, then I'm guessing some companies just aren't accepting that risk. They're just not deploying agents because they can't meet these.
Or they're deploying agents with a lower level risk. So if you kind of go back to that risk tiering, that maybe I'm not ready to release an agent that is going to think about it all in that risk construct. And I think that's the better way. That if you evaluate it from the risk construct and, okay, it's low, it's medium, or it's high. I mean, if you're deploying something in the high, then okay, either you better be pretty advanced from a technical skills point of view, or you better have really good insurance or something. Regulatory landscape, I know we're getting close to time, so I won't go through these, but there's a lot of regulations out there. There's a lot that have been revoked, like the Biden executive orders were revoked. There's new emerging federal legislation in the U.S. That adds, some are comprehensive, some are states' rights. So not only do you have to think of this on a global level, as far as what are some of the geopolitical landscapes that you're in, the U.S. gets specifically complicated because you have states' rights as well. So just like when you look at, there is no universal privacy law within the U.S. Each state implements how it expects privacy to be handled. So I expect this to be continued complexity, within the U.S. In the EU, you have the EU privacy directives, you have GDPR, you have, that's superseded it, where you have essentially the standard there. Within the U.S., you can have federal law and state law that you have to deal with. So these are just things to think about, and it's still evolving. I'd say this part, as far as the most important lesson from the field, is you can't treat this stuff as a checkbox. Oh, there's a question?
I think there's multiple. Thank you. I was wondering if you have strong opinions about what a too big to fail within this context looks like.
So I guess too big to fail within, are you talking about a financial institution? Are you talking about
autonomous systems being deployed broadly?
So I'd say, when we look at the landscape of the financial system, when we talk about safety and soundness, if I look at it from a regulatory point of view of when we levy findings against organizations, if I evaluate, if you're one of the, let's say, 8 largest financial institutions, the ground rule is, in general, nobody gets an A. That's impossible in a regulated world. If you're good, you're going to get something we call observations, which means, you have a good program going on, but there's always room for improvement. Here's areas where you can improve. If you're lower down on the scale, you can have something called like a matter requiring attention, which means we're concerned, you have to fix this within a certain period of time. If you really start scaring us, then you get something called a matter requiring immediate attention. And that means you have a certain time frame to fix it. So what you're talking about is something that we would probably consider like a D1 or D2, where now the gap where the potential control failing is so large that you could impact your neighbors. And by that I mean, when you look at the 8 largest financial institutions in the world and the overnight lending, the money that they supply to other financial institutions, if you knock one of them out, there's going to be significant harm. So it's kind of looked at from that scale. So so by too big to fail, I guess would be how big is your organization? What kind of knock-on effect? If you're too big to fail, if you disappear tomorrow and there's some harm to some people, that's not great. But if you disappear tomorrow and you have a negative impact on your 5 largest competitors or business peers or things like that, that's a problem. So that's kind of systemic impact is hard to come up with, and that's kind of along the lines of how you start thinking about the too big to fail. Like, what kind of consequences are you going to have on your neighbors and society and the economy? Tough one to measure. So again, the thing that I would take away from this slide is, not a static model. It needs to be continuously updated. It has to continuously be evaluated. So you have to have good cross-functional governance. It can't be a policy that no shelfware, that you write it once and hope it stays the same for the next couple of years. So you need to really keep that way going. And then as we kind of wrap up, these are just the key takeaways from some of the stuff is, again, safety and soundness, if you're regulated, if you're doing almost like the prudent person, so as a regulator, we understand that something untoward is going to happen. But it's looked at very differently if you have a good governance foundation that you're taking into consideration safety, soundness, you have a risk management program, you're treating the identities right. So if you're doing these things and something bad happens, like the 0-day equivalent. Okay, that's not great, and it's going to be looked at, but it's going to be completely looked at in a different lens than if you're not doing any of this and you have massive failings, and now you've harmed your customers or your business partners. That's a totally different story. So that, I believe, is it for me. So happy to take any last-minute questions, and sorry I ran over time there.
How do you manage, now that you're on the other side, how do you manage the real politics of budgets and friction innovation, especially, the fundamental technologies that have been evolving so quickly in terms of weeks? What does that look like in terms of?
So I think right now, there's two ways to look at it. The use of all these products is actually very expensive. So the developers, tend to have a little concern for other people's money. So we look at how do we set constraints around that, where once you hit your limit, you have to contact us and be like, okay, well, why do I need to give you higher than that? In general, we're a very forward-looking company, so we want our people working with these things, experimenting with these things in a safe manner. But I also don't want everybody spending thousands of dollars on Gnome each. So they each have a budget depending upon where they are with the organization. Once you hit your budget, you have to open the ticket, and we have to look at it and have a chat. Let's figure out, are you making constructive use of it, or are you just, throwing everything in the sun there? And so I'd say that's the first part of it. The second part of it is trying to figure out how is each division using those tools. So how are my developers using the tools versus how is middle office, back office, and these things using the tools, and what level of specific training do I need to provide them? So it's not easy.
I have more of an abstract question, but with things like this, it seems like almost the regulations you put on humans would be very similar to the regulations you're putting on agents. For example, you're talking about hallucination. I would assume like if a human makes a mistake on a document and that leads to a drug that's being manufactured, the risk is still on the business rather than the human. So is a lot of these things, are they still being borrowed? Like how much can be transferred from kind of what existing regulation exists for humans, and how much can that be transferred over to like thinking about these things?
That's a very good question. So as a former regulator, the first thing that we do is we look at our existing toolbox essentially, and we figure out what rules or what regulations do we have that we can apply. It doesn't work in all cases. Like the principles of safety and soundness, that will work. Because that's been around from an economic perspective, and that makes sense and translates well into AI from that aspect of it. The next part of it is, the model risk management. So now that kind of goes back to, that changes slightly, whereas, when you're just doing traditional machine learning, it'd be acceptable for you to give me your spreadsheet inventory of your models. From a generative AI and agentic AI point of view, that's no longer acceptable, because that model's not static. So it's, we always look to apply what we have, and then we see, do we need new laws or do we need new regulations? And that's very difficult, because again, of how different it is when you look at, just look at, I guess, the U.S. perspective, and again, this is my opinion only, and not that of the Federal Reserve or any other government entity. Okay, so when you start looking at, did we have the right tools to actually regulate crypto? Or was that the right approach of prosecuting rather than saying, get a broker-dealer license or that? So part of it is really looking at how do you really apply the right regulations? Do you have the right regulation? And you need them to give you the enforcement. Because for a while there, it's also like who's on first? Within the U.S. construct of, is it the commodities? Is it the SEC? Is it the OCC if you're a bank? Is it the FTC, or is it the Federal Reserve? So I think a lot of that is very challenging, because what's happening now with all of our tools and technologies, things are becoming so tightly knit together that the line gets blurred. There's no necessarily clear delineation of who's on first. And while from a technology point of view that may work well, from a regulatory environment, that is like a nightmare.
To that last point, do you think that, at least within the United States, the existing administrative bodies exist to properly handle these new risks, or do you think there needs to be some type of new organization that might look like how the NSA started to collect all signal intel post World War II?
So the answer to that, I'm not gonna like, is it depends. Yeah, and I think it depends upon what's the problem you're trying to solve. Because if you look at it from maybe a digital identity point of view, yeah, the Nordics are probably very much ahead of us. They have digital driver's license, digital passport, and things. The fix for that is, I don't know what government agency would be that you bring all those documents that gets signed, and then you get a digital source of digital identity from that. Yeah, so where you have federal and state agencies, it's not an easy solution.
I guess continuing the conversation, if we think of the systemic risk and the too big to fail kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I would argue there's a gap in the regulatory piece in that, yeah, we're talking about systemically important financial institutions or whatever you want to call them, and you're doing the most that you can to follow out these steps. But what happens with these technologies that are now cross-cutting across multiple sectors and that are being implemented everywhere? I would argue, if you think of the Cyber Solarium Commission and the finding of end user liability, should there be another layer of regulation around those tools as opposed to just the institution that uses them?
That's also very hard to answer. Because again, the problem is anytime we add regulation, it's added from a very specific point of view, which means I have to have hopefully a very good understanding of the problem. If you're talking about something where it's a generative AI or an agentic AI that's going to be used from in finance, in healthcare, in manufacturing, and everybody has it, trying to evaluate what the impact is or consistency of how do you apply it to GMP versus how do you apply it to I'm a steel plant versus that's extremely difficult. So the problem is, to some extent, that's why we leverage the safety and soundness and the prudent person principles of hopefully you have a better understanding of your business or your sector than having the government kind of come up with a blanket law that's going to apply to everybody.
But if AWS, there's a massive it's happened multiple times here. It's not on what do you do in those cases?
Being cloud agnostic, and that's one of those things that as an academic, in theory it works great. But if I take off my academic hat and I look at it from the perspective of I'm in the business, in order to say truly cloud agnostic, now I can't use any of Google's APIs, I can't use any of Amazon's APIs because I have to stay agnostic to the point where I can freely move my containers. And that makes the cloud experience visible in general. You want the APIs and you want the benefits of being in Google, AWS, or Azure. So in that case, I have to plan for what's the worst since it takes a major hit. Maybe you have a relationship with Victor's correspondent bank and they provide you a certain amount of coverage. So there's ways for you to be up and functional without saying I have to have 100% of my tech back online. But the question is, do you as an organization take the time to do that planning so if things hit the fan, you can actually do that?
That's actually, I'm going to have to, I think we're going to get kicked out of Bloomberg pretty soon. So, but yeah, David, I think you won on questions out of the entire day. So congratulations. And thank you again.
No worries. Thank you, guys.